The thunder didn't just rumble over Red Rock, it came looking for a name. Rain knifed sideways and the main street turned to a brown river. At the hitch rail, a tall rancher held his breath, and his hands shook inside his coat pockets. Eli Conincade hated crowds, but tonight the town watched him like a hanging was scheduled. If the stage didn't bring his bride, Harland Pike would take his water, his land, and his spine. The coach was late, and every minute stretched tighter than barbed wire in winter. Then hooves burst out of the storm, and lantern light bounced on wet horseflesh. The door swung open, and a woman stepped down like she'd already survived worse. Copper hair stuck to her cheek and green eyes measured the street calm as a card sharp. Eli knew in that first blink that the storm wasn't the only thing hunting tonight. If you like dusty stories with hard choices, subscribe now and ride with me. You keeping your joints warm, friend Eli stood at the edge of town, hat brim low, and waited for Clara Vale to become Mrs. Conincade on paper. He'd signed notes and court papers because Pike had a lawyer's smile and a rattler's patience. Accidents kept happening to lonely men in the basin, and their deeds kept ending up in Pike's desk. Eli could mend fences in a blizzard, yet speaking to a woman made his throat lock tight. When Clara walked toward him, her travel bag looked too light for a whole life. He tried the name the preacher had mailed him, and it cracked anyway. Miss Vale. She studied his face, not cruelly, just careful, then said, "I am Clara." Two churchwomen under the mercantile awning whispered loud, "That's her, the one from the border." Another voice called her a saloon girl, and Eli felt every word hit his ribs. Clara didn't flinch, she just lifted her chin and kept walking through the rain beside him. Eli reached for her elbow to help her up, then pulled back fast when she went stiff as heat. "I'm sorry," he muttered, and she answered, "I'm ready." The buckboard waited by the rail canvas snapping overhead, and Red Rock watched them leave like it owned them. Eli didn't say much on the road, but he kept the reins steady and kept the wagon pointed home. Behind them the gossip faded into thunder, and ahead the prairie opened wide, empty enough to swallow screams. Clara stared forward, and Eli wondered which of them was more afraid tonight now. Night came quick, and the wind kept clawing at the canvas. Mud slapped the wheels, and the prairie swallowed the last lights of Red Rock. Clara sat straight, hands folded, watching the dark like it might speak. Eli drove quiet, jaw tight, and he didn't look at her long. He wanted to say the house was warm and the food was ready. The words stayed trapped because he'd never trusted words to behave. When the ranch finally appeared, it looked small against the storm. A low square house held its ground and smoke curled from the chimney. Eli helped Clara down, careful as if she were glass. She kept her balance, and she didn't offer her hand first. Inside, heat wrapped them fast, and the smell of coffee lived in the boards. The stove snapped bright, and a kettle whispered on the iron. The floor was swept clean, and the table was set plain. Beans, bread, and dried beef waited like someone had planned to be decent. Clara's eyes moved corner to corner, hunting bottles or hidden rage. She found none, and that made her more nervous, not less. Eli cleared his throat and nodded toward a narrow door. "Your things are in there," he said, "and I sleep in the loft." Clara stepped into the bedroom slow, and the quilt looked homemade. A small kindness sat on that bed, and she didn't know how to hold it. She turned back and asked softly, "Do you want me to unpack?" Eli shook his head and poured coffee with shaking hands. They ate with the storm for company, and spoons clicked like distant spurs. Clara kept her eyes on her plate because eyes had always been dangerous. Eli kept his eyes on the fire because flames didn't ask questions. When the dishes were done, silence pooled heavy between them again. Clara stood near the center of the room and drew a long breath. She unbuttoned the top of her collar, and her fingers didn't tremble. Eli froze, and the color drained from his face. "Clara," he whispered, "what are you doing?" She swallowed and kept her gaze low like she'd been taught. "I know what men expect," she said, "and I don't want trouble." "I'm your wife," she added, "and I can try to be good. May I kiss you?" The question hung there, and even the stove seemed to listen. Eli backed up and his shoulder touched the hot iron edge. "No," he said, and the word sounded like it hurt him. Clara flinched anyway because no had always come with punishment. Eli lifted both hands, palms open, and he didn't step closer. "I'm not here to take from you," he said, "and I won't." "You're not something I bought," he said, "not ever." Clara blinked hard, and her chest tightened like a cinch strap. "Then what am I?" she asked. "If I'm not a bargain." Eli breathed out slow, and his voice turned rough with honesty. "You're Clara," he said, "and you're safe in this house." He moved one careful step forward and stopped before she had to retreat. "We'll learn the rest later," he said, "if you still choose it." Clara's knees went weak, and she pressed her forehead to his chest. Eli didn't grab her, and he didn't claim her as proof. He only rested his hand on her shoulder, light as falling ash. Outside, the storm kept hunting, but inside they held on quietly. Morning came sharp and white, and the storm left frost in its wake. Eli rose early because sleep didn't stay long in a man like him. Clara found him at the stove, eyes tired, hands busy trying to look steady. She moved toward the bedroom to fold her dress, and her gaze caught the shelf. A small wooden horse sat there, rough carved with one ear chipped. Beside it lay a faded red ribbon, pressed flat, like it had been held too hard. It looked harmless, but something in Eli changed the second she reached. "Don't," he said, and his voice came out sharp as a snapped rein. Clara jerked her hand back, and the room went tight with old fear. Eli stood in the doorway, pale, breathing too fast, eyes fixed on that shelf. He crossed the room not toward her, but toward the horse and ribbon. His fingers shook as he swept them into a drawer, then slammed it shut. For a moment he just stood there, shoulders high like he was bracing for a blow. Clara didn't move, because she'd learned stillness could save you. Eli swallowed hard, and his throat worked like he was fighting words. "I'm sorry," he said, and the apology sounded raw. "Old things," he added, then tried to smile and failed. Clara nodded once, careful not to push. "I didn't mean to pry," she said. Eli stared at the floorboards, and his voice dropped low. "That horse was my boy's," he said. Clara's breath caught, and she didn't ask more than she should. "A fever took him one winter," Eli went on, "and it took my wife after. I kept the ribbon because it was the last color in the house. When I see it, I forget how to breathe," he admitted. Clara stepped closer, slow, and stopped where his eyes could still choose distance. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Eli nodded, jaw tight, and for the first time he let her touch his sleeve. Not the drawer, just him. The frost didn't soften the basin. It only made every sound louder. Eli fixed a fence post that morning, and the hammer rang like a warning. Clara carried water from the pump, shoulders squared, learning the weight of this place. They spoke little, but the silence had changed. It wasn't fear alone, now it was planning. Near noon, Eli stepped onto the porch with coffee in his hand and stopped cold. The gate stood open, swinging slow in the wind, like it had been pushed by a ghost. Hoofprints stamped the yard deep and fresh, crossing the hard ground toward the post. A sheet of paper was nailed there, edges wet ink, bled but readable. Clara came up behind him, and Eli didn't hide it. He pulled the nail free, unfolded the note, and read it once. "Sell by the end of the month or accidents will decide it for you." One letter sat at the bottom like a spit in the dirt. P. Eli's fingers curled around the paper until it wrinkled. Clara watched his jaw set, and she didn't ask who, because she already knew. "Harland Pike," Eli said, voice flat. "He wants the creek, the pasture, and the right to choke every man downstream." Clara leaned on the porch rail, eyes scanning the open land. "How does he do it?" she asked quietly. Eli stared past the fence line, and his words came slow. "He buys notes when a winter gets cruel. He files papers when a drought makes men desperate. He sends riders at night and calls it bad luck in the daylight. If a man fights back," Eli added, "Pike makes sure nobody stands beside him." Clara's throat tightened and she kept her face still. Eli folded the note neat like neatness could keep rage contained and slid it into his pocket. He turned toward the yard, toward the barn, toward every board he'd built with his own hands. "I won't let him reach you," he said. Clara's eyes flicked to his belt, then back to his face. "Don't turn into him," she said, soft but firm. Eli exhaled through his nose, and some of the heat drained. "I won't," he promised, though promises were thin things out here. Clara stepped closer, and for the first time she took his hand without asking. Then they went back to work because on a ranch, fear didn't stop chores. Red Rock didn't warm up just because the sun came out. The mud dried into ruts, and the gossip dried into something sharper. Clara walked into town with a basket on her arm, and her chin held steady. She'd learned to look calm even when her stomach tightened. At the mercantile, the bell above the door jingled and two men glanced up like she'd tracked in trouble. The clerk weighed beans, slow eyes sliding over her dress, over her hands, over her wedding band like it was a joke. That ring didn't erase her past in their minds, it only gave them a new way to sneer. Clara kept her voice polite because polite was armor. Behind her, a woman whispered, "He's a fool if he thinks he can tame that." Another voice answered, "Pike will have that ranch by snow." Clara paid, took her sack, and stepped out into the alley beside the building because it was shorter. The shadow in there smelled like old whiskey and wet wool. A hand shot out and grabbed her wrist hard enough to make her bones sing. "You the Conincade bride," a man breathed, grinning too wide. Clara went still, because stillness used to keep things from getting worse. His fingers tightened and his other hand moved like he meant to pull her closer. Clara's breath hitched, and the world narrowed to brick wall and dirty snow. Then a second shadow filled the alley mouth, tall and steady. "Let her go," Eli said. The drunk laughed like a rancher's voice couldn't reach into town. Eli stepped in close, grabbed the man's coat front, and slammed him back against the brick. The sound was flat and ugly, and the drunk's grin died fast. Eli's forearm pressed across the man's chest, pinning him without show. "If you touch her again," Eli growled, "you won't walk away." The clerk appeared at the door, eyes wide, but he didn't step in. Two passers-by slowed, hungry for spectacle, but Eli's stare kept them honest. Clara watched Eli's hands, expecting them to shake, expecting him to lose himself. They did shake, but he didn't swing again. He held the line, and that was the thing that mattered. The drunk wheezed, and Eli let him slide down the wall like a sack of feed. Eli turned to Clara, and his voice changed softer. "Are you hurt?" Clara flexed her wrist once and shook her head. "No," she said, then added, "Thank you." Eli swallowed, and his eyes looked almost ashamed. "I wanted to kill him," he admitted. Clara stepped closer, careful, and took his hand, anchoring it. "But you didn't," she said. "I choose you, Eli, not your rage." Eli closed his eyes, a heartbeat, then nodded, like a man making a vow. The next morning the birds went quiet, and that was the first warning. Clara felt it at the creek, the way the air held still, the way even the water sounded wrong. She'd come to rinse cloth and gather kindling, a small chore to keep her hands busy. A shadow moved between cottonwoods, and she froze before she could breathe. A masked rider stepped out slow like he owned the bank. He didn't raise a gun, he didn't need to. A rope hung loose from his saddle horn, swaying gentle, saying enough. "You tell your husband Pike's offer stands," the rider said. Clara backed up one step, and her heels slid on wet stone. The rider reached down quick as a snake, and the rope snapped out toward her. It caught her across the front of her dress, hard and stinging, and she stumbled. Not a noose, not yet, just a promise. She tore free and ran, breath-burning branches clawing at her sleeves. By the time she reached the yard, her skin felt raw under the fabric, and her hands wouldn't stop shaking. Eli saw her from the porch, and his face went blank in a dangerous way. He crossed the distance fast, caught her shoulders, then stopped himself from gripping too hard. "What happened, Clara?" he demanded, voice low. She tried to speak, and only air came at first. "Masked man creek rope," she managed, and Eli's eyes went dark. He turned toward the house like he meant to fetch his guns and never come back. Clara grabbed his sleeve. "Don't," she said, and the word came out stronger than she felt. Eli shook once like a horse fighting the bit. "I'll kill them," he whispered. Clara stepped in front of him, forcing him to see her, not the horizon. "You are not your father," she said. The name landed like a hammer. Eli's knees buckled, and he went down in the dirt like something inside him finally gave way. Clara knelt with him, arms around his shoulders, holding him while he breathed through the fire. They stayed like that until the rage drained into shaking silence. Before dawn, the second warning arrived. Flames climbed the barn walls, hungry and bright, turning night into a sick orange day. Hay cracked and popped, and smoke rolled heavy over the pasture. Eli ran with buckets, with curses, with prayer he didn't believe in. Clara hauled water until her arms screamed. But fire doesn't bargain. By sunrise, black beams leaned against the sky like broken bones. Eli stared at the ashes, chest heaving. "We ride for Cheyenne," he said, voice raw. Clara took his hand, and this time she didn't flinch at the heat in him. "Yes," she said. "We go together." They left before full light, and the ashes still smoked behind them. The road to Cheyenne was long, and the wind cut like a file. Eli rode with his rifle wrapped, and Clara kept the papers oiled. When snow hit the second night, they slept in turns, backs pressed together. By morning their horses trembled, and their bones ached clear through. In town, they went straight to the district office and asked for Marcus Thorne. Thorne listened without blinking, and he read Pike's threats twice. He said the words, "Eli feared we can open a case, but we need a witness." Clara named Molly, and her voice stayed steady on the name. They found the girl near the rail yard, hands raw from soap, eyes darting. Molly whispered she'd testify tomorrow, and then she disappeared into fog. That same night, deputies met them outside their boarding house badges, bright smiles thin. A warrant, said Clara, stole jewelry, and Eli saw Pike's ink all over it. Clara held out her wrists, and she whispered, "If you fight, we hang." The cell was stone cold, and court came fast the next morning. The prosecutor dragged up her past, and laughter tried to turn her small. Clara didn't beg. She said she survived, and she saw Pike order violence. Eli took the stand, and he said, "My wife's truth is stronger than your lies." The judge leaned back, and he gave them 1 day to produce the ledger. Outside, Pike watched from a carriage, and his smile promised more fire. Thorne slipped Eli a note and said, "I sent a telegram, they're already riding, but Pike's men will try a siege, so don't go back alone," Thorne warned. Clara met Eli's eyes through the bars, and she said, "Then I'll get it myself. Tonight." Night laid down over Red Rock like a dark blanket, and the wind kept its mouth shut for once. Clara moved through Pike's club the way a cat moves through a barn, quiet, patient, sure. She found the safe behind a painted wall, and her fingers worked the dial like she'd known hunger longer than fear. The door gave a soft click, and the ledger sat inside, heavy as sin. She wrapped it in cloth and slipped out the back before the floorboards could betray her. Pike met her in the alley anyway, lantern light cutting his face into sharp angles. "You thought you could steal from me," he said, and his men fanned out like wolves. Clara didn't answer. She ran, and gunshots chased her boots through mud and shadow. Eli waited with the horses where Thorne told him to, eyes fixed on the street. When Clara leapt to the saddle, Eli turned them hard toward home. They rode until the sky cracked pale and dust followed like a curse. At the ranch, riders circled the house before they could shut the door. Bullets chewed, boards, glass shattered, and smoke stung their eyes. Eli fired only when he had to, and he reloaded like a man counting heartbeats. Clara held the ledger close, and she shot at shapes, not faces. The siege tightened, and Eli felt the old rage climb again. Then a whistle cut through the gunfire, sharp and official. Federal riders swept the yard, dust and steel, answering Thorne's telegram at last. Pike tried to flee his horse, threw him, and he hit the dirt, looking smaller than his threats. Eli stood over him, fists shaking, and he chose restraint. "I'm not you," he said, and he stepped back so the irons could close. Spring came slow, and they rebuilt board by board, hands blistered, pride stubborn. The barn stood straighter the second time, and the creek kept running like it always had. On a quiet dusk, Clara brushed her hair by lamplight, then faced Eli with steady eyes. "I'm your wife," she said, and this time there was no fear in it. "May I?" Eli smiled soft, and he nodded. "You always choose," he said. "Now, friend, let me tip my hat and tell you plain. Some parts of this tale are stitched together like a patched saddle built to teach and to carry you through the ride. The West was real, the hardship was real, and the choices were real, even when a storyteller smooths the trail. If you've ever had to hold back your own storm, you know exactly what I mean."